This year, in November, World of Warcraft will have reached its 20-year anniversary, and over the course of 10 expansions, hundreds of different raid bosses have come and gone, leaving behind the legendary tales of triumph, drama, and failure. And today, we're going to pay tribute to the base game that started it all, Vanilla, and counting down the top 10 most difficult raid bosses. So difficulty will be determined in the context of their release date. As time has shown, by today's standards, most vanilla raid bosses are actually easier than your mom, but by 2004 to 2007 standards, where everybody sucked as much as your mom, it wasn't so simple. Anyways, coming in at number 10, we have the final boss of the first big raid in Vanilla, the Molten Core, which is Ragnaros, the Fire Lord. So, to set the stage here, we need to talk about raiding during these early years of the MMO. Not just World of Warcraft, but genre-wide, it was still in its infancy. MMOs, being incredibly niche before World of Warcraft's release, focused more on retaining players in the early game, trying to avoid getting them to quit within their first day, or even the first 10 minutes. The primary goal was to get them hooked, and then get them to stay with endgame activities, but as it stood, they were still struggling with the former, and as a result, most of their efforts would be focused on that early game, and leaving the raid bosses neglected by comparison. Today, it's common and expected that these bosses are unique, holding a plethora of complex raid mechanics that require teamwork to overcome, but back then, it was quite common that these badass ultimate raid bosses were simply upscaled, recolored models of normal enemies. They're given a special name, a buff to damage and health, and some special loot to drop. By the time World of Warcraft came out, it was even rare to have instanced raids at that point. So the first large raid, the Molten Core, would hold many such fights, such as the Mind Control Salamander, the Rain of Fire Salamander, and the Group Salamander, and the Group Salamander too. At most, they would have one or two mechanics, so when players cleared through them and reached Ragnaros, he would be quite a roadblock at the time. Other than Onyxia, this was one of the first fights to have different phases, where he would begin up top, requiring at least one melee target, or else he would blow up the raid with magic. And combining this with the fact that he would periodically knock back all melee targets added a tricky timing element where tanks had to swap threat and melee had to periodically fall back to avoid it. Ranged would have to spread out to avoid AoE knockbacks, and after some time he would transition into the submerged phase where he hides and summons mini cells to fight you off, which AoE mana drain and requires tanks to gather them up and keep them away from the caster so they could be killed from ranged. And to top all of this off, this was the first resist fight where raiders had to farm and craft a variety of fire resist equipables and consumes in order to survive, putting a monetary stress on them as well. Again, by today's standards, pretty trivial, but at the time, when these were the first real raids that the genre had seen, this was a definite step above, and it earns the Fire Lord the number 10 spot on our list today. Next, we have Razorgore, the Untamed. It's July 12th, 2005, and the Blackwing Lair raid has just released, and anybody who was playing during this time will remember this absolute brick wall of a boss. This wasn't a raid killer, this was a guild killer. The fight worked as follows. There's a room filled with a bunch of eggs and a giant dragonkin named Razorgore, who essentially makes eye contact with you and then slaps your imaginary girlfriend's ass. This fight revolves around mind control, and the only way to control him is by clicking an orb, and aside from the ass slapping, he has a few other abilities. He has an AoE fireball, a sleep that works on Dragonkin, and, most importantly, an ability that destroys an egg. A player must mind control him, and go about the room destroying one egg at a time while sleeping high health Dragonkin until every single egg is destroyed, at which point phase 2 starts where he must be tanked like a conventional boss. The only problem? Each corner of this room is continuously spawning orcs and Dragonkin that try to kill the players or Razorgore, and if Razorgore dies before all of his eggs are gone, he kills the entire raid. So you need one player to control him, and a backup to take over in case they get interrupted, while the raid splits up into 4 corners and killing adds as they spawn, and leaving the Dragonkin for warriors and hunters to kite as they had too much health to kill without getting overwhelmed. If the players are successful at this, Phase 2 begins, where it's mostly a tank and spank, aside from him randomly conflagrating people, which drops aggro, making it a 2-tank fight, and requiring the range to split away from the melee. So this was a very hectic and complex fight at the time, especially compared to the overall simple Molten core, and it essentially filtered out the unworthy. Today, raids are structured such that they ramp up in difficulty, giving a couple of freebies to start things off, but in 2005, they weren't messing around. Many guilds were demotivated to get brick-walled and only seeing one room of this new shiny raid, and they liquidated as a result. Today, as time has shown, it's not too bad, but again, back then, this was a guild killer, and it earns the number 9 spot on our list. Coming in at number 8, we take a visit to Vanilla's third major raid, the Temple of Ankh-Kiraj, specifically the second to last non-optional boss, the Twin Emperors. This is a 2-boss fight, Veclor and Veclinash. One is a caster who is only vulnerable to magic attacks, and the other melee who is only vulnerable to physical attacks, and they start on opposite ends of the room, which is by design because the big trick with this fight is that if they are too close to each other, they heal. They must be separated from the initial pull to the end of the fight, and to make matters worse, they periodically switch places, dropping all aggro when they do, meaning that a total of 4 tanks were required, 1 physical and 1 caster tank for each side. Additionally, they will cast periodic AoE blizzards that you have to avoid, and the room is also filled with scarabs, which will randomly be selected to grow in size and explode if they aren't killed in time, damaging everybody within the blast radius. So the physical tanking was tricky enough, but casting was another story, and there were a few strategies for it. Typically a warlock builds for it, making a resist and stamina set and talent build, and spamming Searing Pain, which generates more threat. My guild back then just had a warrior continuously spam Battle Shout to get buff aggro, believe it or not. I don't know, maybe that was our bad, but we did kill them eventually using that method. And I've also heard that Horde use shamans sometimes because they're overpowered. But besides the actual mechanics, what made them so difficult was their placement in the raid. Ankh-Kiraj is giant, and every time you died, you started all the way back at the beginning. That's why the trash drops those 100% speed mounts that are only usable within the raid. And you could unlock a teleport, but that was only after you kill the Emperors, making them the worst corpse run in the game, maybe even to this day still. And to make matters worse is that right before their room, they also had those infamous Anubisath giants patrolling about, which would respawn until the Emperors were defeated. And it was quite fast too. These things had random abilities such as a meteor, or an AoE disease plague, among others, or a combination of them, so you couldn't even really develop a strategy around them. And between that and the lengthy run back, it was very common to spend entire raid nights on this trash, and then only getting a few attempts at the Emperors themselves. I remember when we killed them after months of trying. It was a nerdgasm that would have put Joe to shame. So, the Twin Emperors come in at number 8 on our list. Next, if one were to guess which boss stood the longest, I think most would say the final boss, Cthulhu, which is close but incorrect. The longest standing boss in the raid was actually the optional burrowing sandworm, Ouro. He's one of 3 optional bosses within the raid, the others being the Royal Trio and Vicidus, and this worm is only pullable after the aforementioned Twin Emperors boss. So the big worry with Ouro is his Sandblast ability, which is a cone breath that will nuke the raid if they stand in it. He is also one of the hardest hitting bosses in the game, so usually what would kill people is the tank gets bursted down, and he turns to the raid and sandblasts them, resulting in a wipe. He also has the sweep ability, which knocks back and requires a warrior or druid to immediately intercept back in. He will periodically quake areas of the room, which the raid needs to avoid, and he'll also submerge and summon scarabs, which need to be killed before they overwhelm the raid. And he'll also berserk at 20%, increasing his damage and attack speed even further. And what made him tough wasn't necessarily complexity as much as it was just brute force damage. What my guild did was we rotated warriors with shield wall because the damage was just so bursty. Yeah, healers and tanks especially had to be on their game to take down this longest standing AQ40 boss. In Vanilla World of Warcraft, there is an add-on called HealBot, and most know this add-on today to be handy for key binding, but back in its original inception, it worked a little bit differently. It would look at a target player's health, a caster's mana, their plus healing stat, and based off of all of this information, automatically select the most mana-efficient, appropriately ranked healing spell. It was so useful that it was considered by many to be mandatory by high-end raiders at the time due to how powerful it was. And Blizzard, being aware of this, sought to break this add-on in one of the fights in Vanilla's final raid tier, Naxxramas, with the final boss of the Blackwing, Loatheb. So aside from his physical attacks, there are two major sources of damage on this fight: a poison aura, which deals periodic nature damage to melee, and inevitable doom, dealing heavy shadow damage after 10 seconds to everybody, every 30 seconds, about 2 minutes into the fight. But most important is a debuff called Corrupted Mind, which only allows the use of one healing spell every 60 seconds, which severely limits the raid's ability to heal only to tanks, with the rest of the raid being left to fend for themselves with consumables and bandages. And additionally, to actually help the players, these spores will spot around the room, which when killed, give the 5 nearest players a debuff that increases crit chance and prevents threat generation for 90 seconds, so the raid would have to coordinate and rotate who gets the buffs throughout the fight. So it's essentially one giant DPS race, and it would also end up being one of the most expensive fights in the game, requiring protection potions for each attempt. And if you haven't figured it out yet, Loatheb is an anagram for HealBot. This boss was meant to challenge the player's reliance on these powerful add-ons and take them out of their comfort zone and require them to have a very precise rotation on healing. We're going to switch on over to the final boss of the Death Nightwing, the 4 Horsemen. This fight consists of 4 bosses who periodically apply a unique stacking debuff to everybody within 40 yards, and at a certain point it becomes unhealable, so the strategy to beat them is to split them up into the 4 corners of this very large room, and for the entire raid, tanks, healers, and DPS to play merry-go-round, moving from one boss to another before their stacks get too high, and whittling them down little by little. It's a fight that requires a lot of coordination and execution, and it's extremely unforgiving for mistakes, as one screw-up would wipe the entire raid, especially if a tank dies or they mess up their rotation. And aside from the actual mechanics, part of the difficulty from this was just composition. This fight required 8 tanks, and with warriors generally being the only effective tanking class in vanilla, it made recruitment a nightmare, and guilds would constantly poach from other guilds, which would cause a lot of drama. I think today people have figured out how to do it with 5 tanks, which requires perfect execution and no resisted taunts, which also requires a trinket farm in Zul'Gurub. But again, speaking in 2006 standards, we didn't know any of this crap. We were just a bunch of slack-jawed daffodils, and very few guilds ended up clearing this final boss of the Death Nightwing. Next, we have the second to last boss, Sapphiron, who is only unlocked after clearing all 4 of the wings in Naxxramas. This is the frost resist fight of the raid, which that itself warrants a spot on this list. This fight was fucking expensive requiring high-end frost resist gear, absorption potions, and a lot of time to farm the gold to get all of it. Or you could just swipe your credit card, I suppose. But, of course, all of this made you hit like a wet noodle, which just prolonged the fight. The main worry is that there's this constant frost aura that deals damage to the raid throughout the fight, which is the primary reason why you need the resistance. It's a dragon fight, meaning you have to stay away from the head and tail to avoid unnecessary tail swipes and breaths. The ranged were to spread out to minimize the damage from AoE blizzards moving about the raid, while melee had to move together to avoid them, and mages and druids would need to decurse a life drain immediately as it would damage a player and heal Sapphiron. And her other phase was the air phase, where she takes off into the sky and hits 5 random players with an ice block, which is crucial because she follows this up with an insta-kill AoE that can only be avoided if you hide behind an ice-blocked player. And the tough thing with this was that it was random, and it's also an AoE, so you needed to keep spread out throughout this very large room. So what would happen is that she could simply put all of the ice blocks on one side, which would completely screw over the other side as they can't reach it in time. And the ice blocks themselves would deal a lot of damage to the player afflicted, so they would need to be topped off, because if they died, it would disappear, which left the rest of the raid vulnerable to the AoE. It's a very healing intensive fight, and like the other resist fight, I think there's some added difficulty economy-wise having to farm for consumables and frost gear and everything.
Men, servants, soldiers of the cold dark, obey the call of Kel'Thuzad.
Next, we have Kel'Thuzad, and the numbers speak for themselves here. Naxxramas 40-man at its original release was tough. Even making it to this boss was a feat of its own, one that just 1% of the raiding population could say they vanquished. But what awaited them was the grand finale, and rightfully so. This was a 3-phase fight, arguably the most complex in all of Vanilla. It started off with an undead gauntlet. Surrounding the room are these large groups of undead mobs, and Kel'Thuzad will start the fight invincible while the undead slowly rush at you. There are 3 different types you have to worry about. Abominations, which are the trickiest because they have high health, they cleave so they have to be faced away, and they also inflict a healing debuff, meaning that you have to either tank swap or kill them extremely fast before the next one arrives so you don't get overwhelmed. There are skeletons, which have lower health, but if they reach the raid, they explode for AoE damage, so they must be killed before they reach the center, and the raid will wipe if they fail at this. And lastly are the banshees, which must also be killed before they reach the center, as they will knock the raid around and deal AoE damage. This phase persists until all mobs are killed, and it's a big DPS check as it's quite easy to get overwhelmed. But if you're successful, the fight moves forward with phase 2, where you realize it's another resist fight, as he has this frostbolt volley, which hits the raid every 15 seconds, dealing heavy frost damage and slowing everyone. Positioning in this fight is crucial, as every 30 seconds he will ice block a random raid member for 5 seconds, which will spread and stun them and deal 104% of their total health over 5 seconds. So this is something that had to be minimized as much as possible. He will also continuously cast a single target frostbolt on the tank, which must be interrupted. It's just a 2-second cast, so you had to be quick, and he can cast it much faster than a kick or pummel cooldown, which meant that a rotation was required, and combined with the positioning requirement, spacing for melee was incredibly tight. He also spawns the shadow fissures on the ground, which will instantly kill anyone standing in it 3 seconds after they spawn, and he'll also detonate mana, which drains a caster's mana pool and deal AoE arcane damage to anyone nearby, which further reinforces the need to spread out. He will also periodically mind control his main target, wiping threat, which makes 2 tanks minimum a requirement, and the mind controlled must also be crowd controlled. Once he reaches 40% health, phase 3 begins, where he'll spawn 5 Guardians of Ice Crown. These are undead, so they can be shackled, but only 3 at a time. If a 4th is shackled, he'll break them all free, which means coordination is required, and you'll also need 2 more tanks to pick up the loose adds. They deal heavy damage, and it increases the longer they're alive, and the healers at this point are already stressed, which means it's preferable to kite them, which is also tricky because you still need to be spread out to avoid spreading the detonations and ice blocks. And all of this is happening all at once. It is definitely one of the most complex fights in Vanilla, if not the most complex. As mentioned, only 1% of the guilds ever defeated him in original vanilla, so he's certainly worthy of the title of the final boss of the game, and certainly worthy of the number 3 spot on our list. And next, we of course can't skip over Cthulhu himself, specifically before he was nerfed. On that note, this is our first boss on the list that went unkilled. You may have heard that he was famously deemed to be mathematically impossible. A shaman named Gurgthok from the high-end raiding guild, Elitist Jerks, calculated the damage throughout the raid, assumed the best gear available in perfect play, and he concluded that they would always run out of mana before they could kill him. Incidentally, this player was Ian Hazakostas, who later ended up being the game director for World of Warcraft. And there's a bit more interesting lore behind this one before we get into the actual fight. Before the nerf, the nerd rage reached this boiling point of sorts. There's a player named She of the high-end raiding guild Death and Taxes who posted a profanity-laced tirade demanding for the fight to be fixed and calling the developers incompetent for releasing it in such a state and wasting people's time, and threatening that his guild are going to quit and play professional solitaire. This was actually a parody post of a similar one made by Alex Afrasiabi, otherwise known as Fear from Fires of Heaven, which was a high-end raiding guild from EverQuest. When the Plains of Time raid was released, he made the same post, threatening that he and his guild would leave EverQuest if they didn't fix it, and now that he was working at Blizzard, she was essentially mocking him, as Blizzard had now made the same mistake with their own raid. This sparked a 1 a.m. IRC nerd fight, with Afrasiabi saying just because they can't beat the boss doesn't mean he's broken, and that she has Down syndrome. But I digress. Cthulhu was split up into 2 primary phases, the eyeball and the hentai tentacle phases. Even pulling him was a hurdle that most struggled with at first, as one of his most major mechanics was his eye beam, which targeted a random player on his aggro table and chained to another player if they were close enough, doubling in damage. So because of this, the raid had to remain spread out at all times, as it would eventually one-shot if it jumped enough times. And to pull him, the raid has to let the tank run in and give him a lot of room to work with. Or, if you're playing hardcore mode, you can intentionally troll and follow him in and permanently wipe everybody's characters.
Again, do not run in with me.
Wait!
Oh my God.
Patrick, everyone.
What?
Oh, fuck.
Throughout the fight, tentacles will spawn and attack the raid, which need to be killed immediately before they overwhelm them. You have the eyeball tentacles, which have the lowest health and inflict mind flay on a random member, and there are also claw tentacles, which are melee, dealing high damage, and they also knock players up when they spawn, risking an eye beam bouncing around. Periodically, he will cast Dark Glare, where he will emit a giant red beam and rotate around the room, instantly killing any player caught in it, and once this ability ends, the raid must once more spread out in order to avoid chaining the eye beam. So that's phase 1, and once the eyeball is killed, the next phase begins where he'll spawn an even bigger eye and claw tentacles, which similarly must be killed as soon as possible. He takes 99% reduced damage during this phase until you make him vulnerable. Every once in a while he'll swallow random players and they'll enter his stomach, where there'll be some tentacles, which must all be killed before the stacking acid debuff becomes too much to heal. There's a spot to jump out, so usually it takes a few rotations in order to kill these tentacles without sacrificing any players. If successful, he'll become vulnerable to damage for a short period, and then it's rinse and repeat until he's dead. So all of this proved to be quite the challenge for players, but in his initial release, the amount of damage that the ads did and how often they spawned was just too much, and despite months of trying, not a single guild was able to overcome it until he received a pretty hefty nerf. So, you're wondering what could be harder than that? Well, how about a boss that went unkilled for all of vanilla, nerfs or no? Well, a hard mode version of the boss at least. The number one hardest boss in our list is the final of the Zul'Gurub raid, Hakkar 5 Priest. So he comes with a special challenge. Unlike other raids, you could just go straight to him from the entrance and fight him, but it came with a catch. The raid holds 10 bosses total, 5 of them being priests, and for each priest that's up, he gains 50,000 life, as well as a variety of unique abilities specific to each priest. The Bat Priest gives him AoE damage, as well as an 8-second silent. Spider gives him a 6-second stun to the tank, as well as resetting aggro. Tiger gives him a 150% attack speed increase, and the Panther gives him Gouge, which resets aggro, and the Snake Priest made it so Corrupted Blood, which was an important mechanic for the fight, deal poison damage to the raid. And all of this was added onto the normal fight, which worked like this. The main mechanic of the fight is Blood Siphon, where he'll stun the entire raid and drain their life, damaging the players and healing him, unless the player is afflicted with the Corrupted Blood debuff. To get this, you have to pull and kill the infinitely spawning Sons of Hakkar down the stairs, and stand in a pool that they leave behind shortly before the siphon begins. Aside from that, he will mind control his highest threat, making it a 2-tank fight, with the mind controlled requiring crowd control until it wore off. So the fight at its base wasn't the worst, but with these priests, at the time, it was impossible. Although one guild did get close. The same guild mentioned earlier, Elitist Jerks, managed to get him down to 2% with all 5 priests up, just days before the 2.0 pre-patch that came with the Burning Crusade expansion. But that was the closest that anyone ever got. Today, raiding in vanilla is kind of laughed at. As far as difficulty is concerned, it's pretty trivial by today's standards. These raids are cleared in record time, and the difficulty is more shifted towards self-imposed challenges such as parsing and speedrunning. Today, many guilds have cleared 5 Priest Hakkar, but like I said, in 2004 to 2007 culture, although the game was mostly the same, the community was very different. There was no DBM, no nicely edited guides on YouTube to have in your second monitor, or these really helpful database websites, and obviously nearly 2 decades of experience with the game. There's no doubt, the community has mastered it, but during their time, it was another story. I mean, there's a reason why Naxxramas was re-released in the game's second expansion, Wrath. It was because so few people had even seen the raid in its entirety. Today, with the addition of LFR mode and the toughest challenges being funneled into heroic and mythic difficulty, raiding is more accessible than ever before, but this was a luxury that only started in Wrath. Before then, if you couldn't kill a boss, you just couldn't kill it. There was no easier option. You couldn't look it up on YouTube because YouTube didn't exist. The most you had was Warcraft movies, I suppose. I think the fact that there's no easier difficulty to run to should also be a pretty heavy consideration when discussing the difficulty of raid bosses. But whatever the case may be, I hope you enjoyed my video. I'm sure you guys have a different order of this, or maybe you have different bosses entirely. I'd like to see them, so let me know. But aside from that, like the video if you liked it, because I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video.